Welcome to Unlocking Your Truth, another podcast by Dr. Leslie Phillips.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and with Corey.
Hello, everybody. Nice to be back again.
And we are broadcasting on 101.7 FM across the Fraser Valley from the unceded territory of the Stolo Nation. And if you are tuning in for the first time and you don't know what Unlocking Your Truth is, I'll explain. And It's a talk show about metaphysics and spirituality. And every week we have a different topic that we discuss. And sometimes we even have a fabulous guest expert who brings their wisdom and knowledge to share with us.
Like tonight.
Like this evening's show. This evening we have a wonderful guest. Her name is Kirsty Monson. And before I welcome her, let me tell you a little bit about Kirsty and how she's going to help us tonight on the show. So Kirsty has a master's in counseling psychology and in family and marriage therapy from the University of Nevada. And she has a successful counseling practice in Las Vegas. And she teaches continuing education at Weber University. And she's also a staff writer for Ensign magazine. And she's written a ton of books. And they include Texting Through Time series, Love, Hugs and Hope, When Scary Things Happen, Becoming Free, A Woman's Guide to Internal Strength, Family Talk, and also Finding Peace in Times of Tragedy. And I know that today we're going to be talking a lot about finding peace. And she's also written a book called Banished, which is a Native American coming of age book that received a Utah Arts Council Award and the Marilyn Brown Award for Western Literature. And so on tonight's show, we're going to be talking to Kirsty about tragedy, because I'm sure all of us can identify with having experienced some kind of tragedy in our lives. And so how do you cope with that tragedy? How do you deal with that tragedy? What are the methods and processes and techniques that you can use to help you through that? And so Kirsty says, as we meditate daily, seek peace through creative imagery, and give service to those around us, we can build a life full of joy and love. Welcome to the show, Kirsty.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to meeting with you. I have studied some about your works, and I know you do use internal mentors, or feel like we need to find our own internal mentors. And I believe so strongly in that also. So I am really happy to be able to talk with you today and share ideas. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, it's really great to have you on the show. And one of the things that we were going to chat about today is tragedy. And I wonder if you could give us a brief definition of tragedy and the different tragic experiences that people encounter.
Well, I think just watching the news it exposes us to quite a few types of tragedies, and those can, depending on how sensitive we are, those can debilitate us sometimes in our lives and cause fear and anxiety, lots of fear and anxiety, and even depression. Then sometimes we have personal tragedies. Maybe we just have death or divorce or those kind of things happen in our lives, or sometimes we're involved in tragic situations. The lady that I have a story about in the very first of my book, Finding Peace in Times of Tragedy, survived 9/11, and her story is really amazing to me, how she got through that experience. it had to be such a frightening experience for her. So we have tragedy on all different levels in our lives, and we have to find ways that we can soothe ourselves and find the peace and love and quality of life that we look for.
Yeah, I agree. And so I'm kind of interested just to talk a little bit more about tragedy, because it's interesting, isn't it, that there are things that affect us directly in our lives. Like you mentioned, somebody that we love passes away. I don't know, there's a car accident or some other traumatic injury or abuse that takes place. And these are sort of direct, tangible events that are happening in our own reality. But then there are these perhaps more distant events that we see on the news that aren't happening in our immediate environment. And yet, we grasp a hold of them and take them inside as though it's a personal, direct tragedy. And I wonder if you can comment a little bit about the psychology of those two different sources of tragedy.
Yeah, you're right. We have the personal ones in our lives, and then we have the worldwide ones that are happening all too often. There was a research that I talk about in the book that was going on at a sleep studies at Tufts University, and they were in the middle of the research when 9/11 happened, and so they decided they would tap into that. And so these people in the research had nothing to do with 9/11. They didn't know anybody. All they had done was seen what was on the television. And they had significant sleep deprivation and significant nightmares from that, just watching the TV and seeing what had gone on. So I think these things affect us all, and we all have to decide how much we are going to expose ourselves and our children to those kind of things, because I think they can have a significant deficit on the quality of our lives. I choose not to involve myself too much with that because it's difficult for me to process through it. It's hard for me, so I choose not to expose myself to too much of that.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, isn't it? And just to add a little spiritual perspective as well to that I actually just thought of when you were talking, and it's a thing that happened to me at 911, which might sound a bit strange, but this show's about spirituality and metaphysics and intuition and things like that. And my belief anyway is that there's our waking consciousness in 3D reality, and then when we're asleep at night, we leave the body, and there are other experiences that we have outside of the body that we may or may not bring back. And so when 911 happened, I felt quite disturbed after it. And I couldn't explain it. And what had actually happened is I'd been out there on the astral plane, in the sort of mass consciousness reality, engaging in what we were all engaged in on that level of reality. And I'd brought some of that energy back into my space. In fact, I'd actually brought some of the energy of one of the people who was piloting one of the planes. And so at the time I was doing my spiritual development. And so I had some friends who helped move the energy of that person out of my space. And so, I think that there's the level in terms of our 3D reality and watching television and all of that, but there's also this added spiritual, call it, what a psychologist might call things that are happening more on the unconscious level as well. Yes, so.
I agree with that. I think that's very important, and I think I like your way of defining that. I think it rings true to me. It rings very true to me, and so I have to be careful how much of that I absorb within myself, because it is there for me, and I do identify with those people, and and they become part of me, and then I'm hurting like they're hurting, and it adds a burden to me sometimes that is difficult for me to work through.
Absolutely, yes.
Do you find that in the work that you do you find that there are both extremes as well? Some people just don't get affected at all by, you know, like personal tragedies in their life, like death and injury and even worldly events.
I agree with that. I think that's true. Sometimes people are just more sensitive than others, and they absorb those kind of things. And I don't know. I haven't done a lot of research on this, but my theory is that those of us who are more empathetic towards people will absorb more of that than others will. And sometimes people are able to put up a barrier where they don't absorb that. But many times people do that are sensitive.
Yeah. And then there's also the aspect of being in denial and pushing it down. And
very true.
Saying it hasn't affected you when in actuality it's been buried really deep. And
that is very
you later on. Yeah. So
well, and it's go ahead, sorry.
That's okay, please continue.
It's very interesting to me if you look at the stories in the book. The 9/11 survivor, she just wanted to go back to work the next day, and so she kind of put that behind her, and off she went to up in a 32-story building to continue her work. And even to this day, she has trouble being associated with any of that kind of energy or any of the thoughts or anything going on about that. Where some of the other people, the rape victim and the young man whose father committed suicide, those people have worked through their issues, and they're able to talk about them and have released some of the negativity and been able to find internal mentors that have helped them through their path. I believe strongly that we all have internal guides, and that we need to look for those guides as we do our daily meditation, because I think that's a way for us to process through and enhance ourselves, to really find the best that we can be and become the people that we were meant to be.
Yeah. And I mean, I suppose one could actually also say that one's body can be one's guide. We had a show this week. Our radio show was about, actually it was about physical illness, but it was about the origins of physical illness and how the origins of physical illness can be in trauma, based in trauma, and that the first level that it's expressed through is the emotional level. So the body may talk through being angry, through being afraid. But if you ignore that, then you might get caught up in some unhealthy mental patterns, and eventually it will emerge as a physical illness. And so, I mean, it's the same here, really, isn't it? That there are that it can come out on an emotional, a mental, or even a physical manifestation, if it's not dealt with and processed at the time it happens.
Very, very true. I feel like it's so important that if we do the emotional work, we do the cognitive and emotional work that is associated with it, but also the body work. I have a story of a young lady. She was a young adult who had been repeatedly raped by her stepfather, and so, she was into kickboxing and karate, and so she just got herself a great big punching bag and hung it up in her garage, and every afternoon there she was out there. She plastered her perpetrator's face on the punching bag, and off she went to kickbox through her feelings. I agree with that. I think that's so important. It can manifest itself in so many ways. If we really want to free ourselves, we have to work through all the different areas.
Yeah. And one of the most fascinating ones to me is, like you said, it's the body level, because there can be a trauma that happened really early in life, before someone can speak and before someone can process information in the logical mind. And then it's a kind of cellular response. I mean, for example, let's say you have an authoritarian parent that shouts at you, and then later in adulthood, when your husband shouts at you, you freeze. And it doesn't make sense to your logical mind. You can't break out of that pattern approaching it from the logical mind, because it's kind of like a cellular level imprint.
Absolutely, that is so true. And I have an example of that in our own family. Our youngest daughter was born very premature at 24 weeks, and she was in an ICU and had needles all over the place in her when she was very tiny, just a few weeks old. She was under 1,000 grams, just a tiny child. But as she grew older, whenever she'd have to go to get to the doctors to get a shot or anything, there would be that freeze response. And of course, all those things happened to her precognitive. So you see, you're absolutely right. That's all happens way before, and she had some work to do to get through that. So that's absolutely correct. That's why I think we have to, at least for many of my clients, an internal guide was so helpful. I had abuse survivors that would set up a hospital inside their head when they would do their meditation, and there would be a kind nurse there to help with the body work, that precognitive, because the abuse had happened so young to them. And they were able to heal through the creative imagery, I like to call it. But anyway, they would have a guide there that would help them work through those processes so that they could release some of that.
And so, and I agree that it can be a really great approach. I mean, it's funny, like as a kid, I naturally had little rooms I used to go into, my healing room and my rooms, and so I'm familiar with what you're talking about. Now, can you talk a little bit about the integration of that? Because that type of approach, it's happening in somewhat outside of the body, and then we're wanting to integrate the change into the physical body. So maybe we can you think about that. We're going to have to go to a break, and we'll pick your brains about this approach of inner visualization, working with an inner guide, and then how that then gets integrated into the body and into the waking consciousness. Listeners,
all very interesting.
Yeah, listeners, you're tuning into Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and Corey and our guest, Christy Monson. I think I called her Kirsty once or twice, so it's Christy.
That's fine. It's totally okay.
It's
also 911, not 911.
No, that's I love it. It's great.
Yeah.
It's perfect.
So listeners, we're going to be back after these messages. Welcome back, listeners. You are tuning in to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and Corey, and our guest this evening, who is called Christy Monson. And we're talking to Christy about tragedy and how to deal with tragedy and how to transcend tragedy. And Christy is she has a master's in psychology and marriage and family therapy, and she's written a lot of books on this subject, including a book called Finding Peace in Times of Tragedy. And so we've been drawing on her wisdom about this subject, because I'm sure there's probably not a single one of you listening that hasn't suffered some kind of tragedy in your life at some point. And so before the break, we started to talk about some of the methods and processes that Christy uses that help her clients to process and transcend these issues. And we were talking about this process of visualization, whereby the person going through the process imagines that they have their personal inner room or sanctum that they go into. It can be their healing room or serve some other function, and then they go and access guidance in that through that guided imagery and that visualization. And I asked a question to Christy before the break, which was, because that process is kind of happening mentally or maybe even outside of the body, how does that integrate then into the holistically throughout the whole person and their system, so that the new pattern is embedded as they then move forward in their everyday life?
I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer for any of this. I think we all have to find our own way. And just to go back a little bit before I answer your questions, when people are looking for their internal guide or their internal strength, sometimes it will be in a hospital room, but sometimes it will be on the beach or on the seashore. It can be any place, and I'm always very careful not to guide people the way I think they ought to go, because I think they need to come to their own reality themselves. This is not something that we can do for them. And so I feel like that is a very important concept. Let me give you an example from my own life. When my father was killed in a car crash when I was 6 years old, and I didn't understand what was happening, so he was always the one to put me to bed, and we would sit and read books every night before I went to bed, and he would hold me and hug me, and so my little 6-year-old mind couldn't wrap around the fact that he wasn't coming home at night. I didn't quite understand. And so when I got into bed, even though my mother tucked me in, I would spend time visualizing Father here and being with me and mentoring me, and we read books together. And even today, books have always been very important to me, and they have been something that really matters in my life. And so I can, when I myself get a cold or getting overstressed or something, all I have to do is get myself a book and curl up in bed. And there I am, back to those inner beginnings of my childhood, being able to work through the trauma in my life. And that is the way that I release. Many of my clients used other methods, and they were all physically, they all physically had to find their own release. So I think it's important, again, that we do the body work, or at least the people that I have worked that really have found the healing that they needed to find some way to do their own body work.
Right. And so I have a question about the body work, but also I just wanted to validate and agree with you about each person finding their own process, and if they're doing that visualization to creating their own reality. I mean, I had about 4 or 5 different places that I used to go to when I was a kid. One of them, I had my own personal spaceship, and I used to fly to another world.
That's awesome.
Where the beings would bring all of these lights and heal me, and then I'd fly back and I'd feel better. So, I guess that there's so, our creativity is unending, and each of us can have our own personal inner realities that work for us. Now, you said at the end when you were answering that question, it's really important that people come to their own body work. So maybe you can tell us about what you're referring to when you say body work, because I think of those visualizations as not being body work. So correct me if I'm wrong if you do, but what do you mean when you say body work?
Well, like for instance, in my own life, you see, I still sometimes will use my body work of curling up in bed with a book to read, because that's something that is really helpful for me. And here's another interesting situation. I had a client that had moved to Las Vegas from Michigan, and he and his friend had been out on their snowmobiles in the wintertime, and they had gotten too close to they were on the ice shelf, on the lake, and his friend had gotten too close to the edge, and the ice had cracked and he'd fallen in. and he tried to save his friend. I won't go into all the details. He tried to save his friend, but he could not. The friend drowned. And so he had done what I call a geographic fix, which he had moved to Las Vegas, which is far away from the Michigan snow and ice, thinking that he would be fine. But you see, as he sat in my office, his arms and hands were just, his leg was wiggling, his body was tense, his hands were opening and closing. He still had all of the physical memory inside of him that he had to release. And so we talked about that. We talked about how was he going to release this. I could pull it up and say, well, look at you. You're so tense inside. What are you going to do to release that? And so then he had several ways that he decided he would release that. Part of it, he loved to play basketball, and so he would play basketball in the gym. But part of it was working with a physical trainer to help him release these memories. And I wasn't involved in that, but he did get himself a personal trainer to help him release those kind of things. So I think we all have got to do whatever works. I have had dancers. I had a fellow that he was about 18 or 19 when World War II happened, and he was quite a bit older when I first saw him. But he had danced all his life. He had become a choreographer. He had survived Auschwitz, and so he had a lot of. He hadn't really worked through some of that, but he found that he had enough release, and he could keep himself together if he danced and did his choreography work. And he was in charge of one of the dance companies down at one of the big hotels in Las Vegas. And so even though he hadn't processed some of those memories, he was able to keep himself on I will say just a status quo, because he had so much physical. He did the physical release daily.
Yeah, that brings up I have a client at the moment who is unable to move her body at all, and so I was just thinking, for somebody like that, I guess the physical release work, all it can be is to do with the breath, perhaps. I mean, what in a case where somebody is paralyzed and really can't have a physical expression?
That's so interesting. That's very interesting. And so has that worked for her? Has the breathing techniques, do they work for her as a release?
She's on a respirator, so that determines the rhythm of her breathing. So that's interesting, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. I've never run into anything like that. That is very interesting to me. I
mean, at the moment, I am, giving her some healing, and we're doing some, I guess, visualization. She can do the visualization, but in terms of the physical, interesting. Neither of us have an answer for that one.
It's almost like being locked in a bit of a prison.
It is. That's exactly what it is.
You can't get out.
Yeah.
You can't express yourself properly, and there's very little she can do. I mean, she can't, as you said earlier, Christy, she can't buy a punching bag and put it up in her basement.
No.
She can visualize, and she can move her eyes to communicate.
Well, and I wonder if the breathing, we use breathing techniques a lot, and many of my clients do use the breathing techniques along with their meditation to help them release. And so the breathing can be a release.
Yes. And even if it's the respirator that's determining the rhythm of the breath, you can still tune into the lungs.
She's still involved.
And there's still the sensation of that happening, isn't there? There's still the rhythm of that happening. So perhaps that's a segue to talk about breathing techniques and meditation. Maybe you can tell us how you use breathing techniques and meditation in the work that you do.
Well, I just use the regular breathing techniques of where you breathe in, and of course you use your diaphragm breathing, and you breathe in and until you've filled your lungs, and then you just breathe out very slowly. And some people like to count, and some people don't like to count. That is, I don't know what you've come across in your work, but I allow them to choose. If they would like to count along with their breathing in and breathing out, then they do that. If that is not something that sometimes is a trigger for some of them, then I don't have them do the counting. But sometimes that is helpful for them, and then release. And as they do that, I think the breathing is a way to release. It flushes out, if you will, the body, just like I think we need to drink a lot and flush our system of the toxins sometimes that are in it. I think toxins can be physical, they can also be mental, and I think that they can be flushed out that way also. And to me, when they do their breathing, it's a cleansing process along with the meditation to help them to free wherever they're at, so that they really can clearly visualize and focus on the things that they need to be aware of to find that internal mentor and that internal guide.
Now, breathing is interesting. It's very powerful. Of course, I mean, it helps you live, but I mean, what it is, breathing, it can really bring a person back to centering. Actually, the lack of breath, I found.
That's right.
I found a little technique that when somebody starts panicking in any way, shape, or form, you get them to hold their breath and hold it and just keep holding it. And what happens is the longer they hold it and then expel it and then not breathe in for as long as they can. And that brings the person right to a grounding, because all of a sudden the body stops.
Yes.
It stops completely dead, saying, uh-oh, I'm threatened here. My life is threatened. I have to be here completely present for a second. And it really can calm people down instantaneously. It's an amazing thing.
That's true. That is very true. And sometimes you can head off a panic attack that way.
Exactly.
Because you stop that fast breathing, because that's part of panic attack, and you just cut that off at the pass. So yes, that's absolutely a good way to just bypass that. Good.
Yeah. And there are many different breathing techniques, and I think I'm with you, Christy, that I would never force any one technique or bunch of techniques on a person. They're things that we can offer them, that if then it works for them,
yes,
they can practice. So for example, there might be someone who just to deeply breathe in and out and focus on the body, and that works for them. Or the one that Corey suggested, or there's techniques, isn't there, square breathing, where you breathe in on the count of 4, hold on the count of 4, breathe out on the count of 4, hold on the count, and do a breathing pattern like that. Or the ascending breath, where you move your attention up and down the body following the breath, for example. So there's many different options of breathing techniques and meditation techniques that
that's true. And then all of those, like you have said, are centering. Those all center us. I like to, the last chapter in my book, I've got just a little quick pickup. Sometimes we all have a down day, and if we do our breathing technique, we do our meditation, and we smile, we can, at least for me, I can pull myself out of that. And many of my clients, I can just pull myself out of that. It's like I just cut off at the pass, and off I am to another path. I just go another way, and that's always very helpful.
I like that. And you smile. And it's funny, I've never thought of that before, but it's true, isn't it? If you just smile, it really changes the way that you feel. And that's a very quick shift.
Yeah, well, also, breathing, there's 3 things involved. With breathing, you start breathing rapidly if you're depressed or if you're anxious, your breathing changes, your face changes, but also your stance. Your stance will change as well. Someone who's depressed is like they lean over, they slouch. Somebody who's fear, they cower. But if you stand straight and erect, it also changes. It's one of the three things that will actually change your mental view on things. It's quite neat how the body and the mind work interactively like that.
Those are wonderful techniques to use with children, and I worked with children fairly often. And if you do those things, you can help a child walk on the bullying that they have had in school. Like if they stand up straight and are erect and look at people, that little bit makes a huge difference in kids' life.
So let's talk a little bit. You've alluded to this a few times about the internal guide, because I know that this is a subject that our listeners love. They love talking about guides. They love talking about spirit guides. They love talking about angels, ascended masters, all of the different energy beings that they might connect with and communicate with that can help them. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about your perspective on working with an internal guide, what that might look like, who that guide might be.
Oh, I love this subject, and that's why I was very excited to talk with you today, because I thought, oh good, somebody else really believes in this just like I do. I feel like this can aid people in healing in a way that no other technique can. I do love working with it. I will not ever force, or not, I don't want to use the word force, but I won't guide someone to find their eternal mentor. I will let them do that. That must come as they would like it to be. And I do believe that there are people from angels, from the beyond, however you would like to say it, that will come and help us. There's research been done with children that if they know their family stories, if they know the stories of their ancestors, the strength, the courageous of their ancestors, the child is much better able to handle life. He's more grounded if he knows the stories of the people that he came from. And so this is an important thing, at least for me. The reason I wrote Banished, and I'm really not off the subject on this, well, sort of.
I'll tell you what, Christy, we have to go for a break. So when we
okay,
come
then
back,
we'll do this one. Come back.
Let's talk about Banished, and let's talk about ancestors and all of that when we come back. So
okay.
You're tuning into Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and Corey and our guest, Christy Manson. And we're talking about tragedy and how to transcend tragedy and have a life of peace and joy. And we just got started on a topic that I know you all love, which is guides and inner guides. So we'll be back after these messages to talk some more about that. Welcome back, listeners. You're tuning in to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and Corey and our guest, Christy Manson. Oh dear, I said your surname.
You're good. I don't care.
So, and before the break, you mentioned your book Banished, which I believe it relates to Native American First Nations who actually both in America and in Canada went through some pretty severe trauma. And you were just starting to say how helpful it is for a child to know of their ancestry. And because in some cultures, the ancestors are the guides, aren't they?
That is true, and that's exactly where I'm going. So thank you for that segue. That was just perfect. As I studied the Native American religions, I wrote this story, and it's fictional, but this young boy has no one to guide him, and his father comes back to him as an eagle, and so this eagle is his guide through the book. And I had a couple of young boys that were Native American in practice, and so I said to them that they needed to connect with their ancestors. However they wanted to do that, they needed to know what their stories were. So they came back the next session and said, well, if we're going to do this, you have to do this. And I said, okay, I would be happy to write a story about a Native American. And so that's where this book was born, as I began my story, just like they began their stories. And of course, then I didn't lay mine down. I finished it into a book. But I think we need to go with whatever culture our clients come from. I think we need to look at them as they view the world. And many cultures use their ancestors as guides. I have my grandmother is a wonderful guide for me at times. And like I told you, after my father was killed, then he was my guide for many years. And so I believe that ancestors can be guides. And again, the research that has been done with the children say that if the kids know their stories, then they are much better grounded. And I'm not saying that all these kids are using their ancestors as their guides, but I think it's a definite possibility if they would like to do that. But then I had some abuse clients who would never think of doing anything like that. One of them used a tree as her guide because that symbolized strength to her. And so I think we have to let them find a way that works for them. I had a person from the island that used the sea was his guide. He would go to the sea, and the sea would direct him in the path that he would go. Well, the sea doesn't seem like an internal guide at all, but to him that was what worked for him. So I think, at least for me, I was very cognizant of where they came from and what their belief system was, and then we worked within that belief system for them to find what was best for them.
Yes, and I can understand that, and that's so wonderful. I can see how someone who's been abused might feel safer with a tree than a person, and I mean, nature is such a wonderful teacher, and in many of the ancient traditions, the different aspects of nature have divine beings associated with them. That there is a spirit of
yes, they do.
And a spirit of the waterfall that we can communicate with and ask for help and assistance. So that's fantastic. And so, what else can you share with us about? Let's imagine with some of the listeners have never done this kind of a visualization before, and they'd like to try it. Let's give them a few. Okay, well, it's pointers. Oh, I'm happy to do that. For me, with my clients, we would start, and they would sit in a comfortable place, and many times clients would like to have music going in the background. Others didn't want that; they wanted it silent. And then as you become just aware of your surroundings and feel your chair and your couch or wherever you're sitting, just be aware of the moment. And then to do your deep breathing, your internal, that you breathe in and then hold your breath and then breathe out. Count if you want to. Sometimes clients would climb steps to get to their safe place, wherever their safe place was. My clients that had the internal hospital would climb steps to get to their hospitals. Others would go down the hill to the beach if their beach was their safe place, and then they would connect with their guide. And sometimes they would just need to sit and be quiet and think about that guide and who that guide was and what that guide would need to do for them. And sometimes it would take several sessions of meditation for them to find the guide. And many times it was a person, but like I say, other times it was an object of nature. And then they were to sit with that guide, and they would have to get to know that guide. And so I would ask them to explain what was going on in their lives and to share with their guide what was happening, and then find out about that guide. They could interview the guide and come to know that guide well. And then as they finished the session, they would come back to the room, and then I would ask them through the week to do some journaling. And some of them were artists and would draw their guides, and others of them
would just journal and write about their guide so that they came to know this person very well. And then when they would go into their visualization again, then they would know a little bit more about that guide, and little by little they would get to become friends, because of course this might be somebody that they didn't know, or maybe it was somebody like my dad that I knew very well, and I didn't need to spend that getting acquainted time, but sometimes they do need to spend that time getting to know them. And then as they spend the time with them, we would in our sessions, we would always talk about what they would like to ask the guide, or how the guide could be of help to them. And so I would just help them organize what they wanted to say and what they wanted to accomplish in each visualization. And as they were about that process, then when they would do their visualizations through the week, they would know what they, just kind of help them get organized to know what they would talk about. And then it just kind of rolled out as time went along. And it was a healing for them. It was a centering, like you have said, it was a centering process in the beginning, and then that healing was inside of them. They found it within themselves. It was the path to wholeness that they needed to find, and it was within themselves.
Yes, and working with a guide can make you feel so supported and loved when perhaps
absolutely
doesn't feel that way. So
yeah.
I wanted to come back to talking about tragedy and trauma, and let's use the example of, and Corey can probably remember and tell this story a bit better than I can, but I remember we met once a mother whose child had been run over, I think, by a drunk driver. And she could not forgive, and she could not move on. And it's understandable. And she could not, in spiritual circles, we often talk about, well, that when somebody passes on, it's never an accident, that everyone leaves when it's their time and it's their agreement with God to do so. And she could not accept that concept. It was not helpful to her either, which you can also understand. And so I'm just wondering, in something like that, I mean, it's hard to understand how someone gets stuck in a tragedy like the death of a child.
But she wasn't. To me, she wasn't stuck in the tragedy of that child's loss. She was stuck in her own issue of not being able to forgive. She couldn't move forward. She couldn't forgive herself. She couldn't forgive the person that hit the child. She just they were looking for. She was looking for a way to get back. She was looking for revenge. She wasn't looking for a way out. She was looking for a way of revenge, which is a completely different situation. Yes. But yet it's different, but it's not different. I mean, to move on from that,
it's a possible thing that can occur after a tragedy is to want revenge, isn't it? So maybe, Christy, you can comment on being stuck and unable to forgive and unable to move on, and being consumed by the desire for revenge.
Yeah. That was 10 years later when we spoke to her after the event.
Yeah, it had been hard for her. I had a lady that had an experience that was not exact like this, but she had left her 1-year-old in the bathtub, and the baby and gone to answer the telephone, and the baby had drowned. And so she could not forgive herself for that. That was a terrible tragedy. And so as we worked in therapy, I found with her that the key to it was to be able to connect with that child and love that child in a way that was good for her. And so she built a relationship with this child as part of her guided imagery. This child, she and the child spent time together, and they loved each other, and they enjoyed the time that they had together. And then she was able, finally, it took her a couple of years. It was a long process for her to let go of that, because she had punished herself for so much. But she really was in a debilitated state because she could not move beyond it. But it was building that relationship with the child that was good for her. And I don't know how this lady was that you worked with, but I think just like I had a relationship with my father after he was killed, I believe we can have a relationship with those people that have passed to the other side. They can be there with us. They can be closer than we think. We can imagine. They can be part of our lives. And as she can do that, she'll have a different kind of a relationship with her daughter, but she can still have a relationship with her daughter, because I would guess that she was probably stuck in the place that she couldn't forgive because of the loss that she'd felt. So this is a way we can't recoup the loss that we've had, but we can have the relationship in a way that's a little different than we did before. Just like with my father, I have to say that I had a relationship with him after he was killed, and I don't know if it would have been a better relationship if he had lived, but it was a good relationship with him on the other side.
And so, because I believe you do some grief counseling as well, and so would that be your approach to dealing with grief? Is actually to continue the relationship beyond death in the way that you're talking about?
Yes.
I really like that idea and that approach.
We're all connected with each other.
Yeah.
We're not separated, and so life isn't lonely. My husband passed away at just about a little over a year ago, and we still have conversations, and we still talk about things, and we still work out how I'm going to learn how to turn the automatic sprinklers on and those kind of things. And you know what? We have a conversation, we get it done.
I've got one last question, and it's a slightly different case again, because I've seen some cases where the childhood abuse is being so severe that someone ends up in a different reality. And so I guess as a psychologist might call some of this having multiple personality disorder, or imaginary persecution complex. But I've seen people with believing in persecution by, I guess, what some psychologists might call imaginary beings, and someone like me might see them as either being real entities or a projection, a thought projection. And so I wonder if you can comment about that, how abuse can result in losing touch with reality, and how to come back to, and the reality is real for them, but us looking from the outside might say, that's far removed from where most of us are.
I worked with quite a few people that were diagnosed with multiple personality in the beginning of my practice, and I think for me these were probably very bright, intelligent children that suffered severe abuse, and this was their way of dealing with things. We all have imaginary friends. Well, not everybody, but a lot of us have imaginary friends when we're young, and this is their reality. This is their way of dealing with it. And as these people, again, I let them work their own way towards healing, whatever that meant. And some of them wanted to absorb these fractionalized parts, I guess, of themselves in one entity, and others liked to keep the separateness. And so I think everyone has to find their own path on this, and I don't believe that we all have a reality, because each one of us at times will, with our guided imagery or our mentor, some people say, well, that's weird that you should do something like that. But I feel like it's okay for us to do those kind of things, and I feel like it's all right for us to be that way. And I feel like everyone needs to find the path to wholeness that's going to work for them. And so I had some people with multiple personalities that they'd have a boardroom so they'd get their board together and decide what they were going to do about this. Or if one of them had parked the car and the other one didn't know where the car was when they came out of they had to be able to talk to each other. So they have to at least be able to communicate with each other. And that was part of the healing process, was for them to be able to work together in this. But they needed to work, at least their healing was varied, and they were some of the ones that had the internal hospitals. They had to find their own path, and some of them integrated and some of them didn't want to, and that's good. It's okay.
Yeah.
What you're doing is almost a form of self-hypnosis in a way.
That's correct.
It's a neurolinguistic it's a neurolinguistic programming method, just to get people to select a different option as a result to an issue that they're having. It's quite intensively used, and it works really well. Some people say it doesn't last, but it does last if people use. It's like anything else. If you don't use it, it doesn't last. Right? Let's say meditation is phenomenal.
That's correct.
But you don't meditate once and let it go. You have to continue on to get the effects.
Wisely said. Very good points. That was. Did you hear that, Leslie?
She said it was wisely said.
Oh,
well, we've got to let go now, because it's almost time, Leslie.
I know, yes, and it's been lovely talking to you, Christy. And maybe could you tell our listeners, if they would like to know more, if they would perhaps like to purchase one of your books or several of your books, or get in touch with you, how can they do that?
Oh, I have my website. I don't know if you're going to put that on with your media. I'll post it when you post a link to the show. I'll put it on my website.
Yeah.
My website is www.christymonson.com. So it's really easy. And my books are all on Amazon. Amazon, easiest way to find them if they're interested.
Yes.
I just want to say, though, how much I have enjoyed talking with you. I love this subject. I love working together. So thank you so much for having me. I really have enjoyed myself.
No, it's our pleasure, Christy.
Yeah, our pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your wisdom and for inspiring our listeners and giving them some processes that they can use in their own lives. So bye, listeners. You've been tuning in to Unlocking Your Truth, and we will be back next Tuesday at 7 o'clock Pacific time on 101.7 FM.
See you then. Thank you for joining us. You've been listening to another Unlocking Your Truth podcast by Dr. Leslie Phillips. For more information, go to our website at drlesleyphillips.com. That's drlesleyphillips.com, where you can ask questions or send her an email, and there's many free gifts on there for you as well. You can also find the questions that were asked during this show at the website on our free card reading podcast page, where you'll find a full list of them. Come back again.